They say patience is a virtue, but what they don't tell you is that patience can also be the ultimate weapon. When Victoria Blackwell and her fancy Sunridge Estates development crew decided to build 96 luxury homes on the eastern edge of my grandfather's land, they thought they were dealing with just another pushover country boy. What they didn't realize was that every foundation they poured, every nail they hammered, and every "no trespassing" sign they planted was playing directly into my hands. By the time they understood what was happening, it was too late. They had already fallen into a trap 20 years in the making. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is James Porter, and for 3 generations, my family has owned Porter's Ridge, a sprawling 120-acre property in Pinecrest County. My grandfather wasn't just a farmer, he was a visionary who understood that land was the one thing they weren't making any more of. "Hold on to it, Jimmy," he'd tell me. "The world changes, but the ground beneath your feet, that's your anchor." Those words meant little to me as a kid racing through meadows and climbing oak trees, but they became my mantra after he passed and left the entire property in my name. I didn't live on the property full-time. I had a small cabin there that I'd visit on weekends, but my primary residence was in the city about 40 minutes away, where I worked as a civil engineer. That distance became crucial to what would eventually unfold. You see, while I wasn't there watching every day, Pinecrest County was transforming. What used to be rolling farmland was rapidly becoming prime real estate for luxury developments as the nearby city expanded. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a glossy brochure in my mailbox. Sunridge Estates, exclusive living in nature's embrace. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were planning to clear-cut forests to create their version of nature's embrace. But what caught my attention was the map on the back page. The planned community bordered my property to the south, but the artistic rendering showed walking trails and a community nature preserve extending well beyond where my property line had stood for decades. I might have written it off as a design error if not for the business card paperclipped to the brochure. Victoria Blackwell, HOA President, Sunridge Estates. Beneath her name, a handwritten note. "Mr. Porter, let's discuss how your property can benefit our community vision. Coffee next week?" Her phone number was circled in red ink. I never called her. Instead, I drove out to Porter's Ridge that weekend to check my boundary markers. 3 of them had been moved, not by weather or wildlife, but deliberately repositioned about 30 feet onto my land. Someone had been tampering with my property lines, and I had a strong suspicion who was behind it. Monday morning, I took the day off work and visited the county recorder's office. I requested copies of all my property documents, surveys from the last 50 years, and any recent filings regarding adjacent properties. The clerk, a woman named Doris who'd known my grandfather, gave me a concerned look. "Funny you should ask, James. Someone was in here last month asking about Porter's Ridge, said they were doing environmental assessments for future development. I told them your family has owned that land clean and clear since before I was born." "Did they leave a name?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. "Sunridge Development Group, woman named Blackwell. Seemed mighty interested in the Eastern Boundary Survey from 1973. That survey had been contested and later corrected in 1975 after a neighbor tried to claim 10 acres of our land, a fact that wouldn't be obvious unless you knew to look for the amended filing. I thanked Doris and asked her to call me if anyone else came asking questions. Then I visited a lawyer, Maria Gonzalez, the best property rights attorney in the county. "They're testing the waters," Maria said after reviewing my documents. "Moving boundary markers is illegal, but they're hoping you won't notice until they can establish some kind of claim through continued use. It's underhanded, but not uncommon when big money's involved. What should I do? I asked. Document everything. Replace your markers, post clear signage, and whatever you do, don't engage directly with this Blackwell woman yet. Let's see what they do next. I followed Maria's advice, and then some. I replaced the boundary markers with concrete posts driven 4 feet into the ground. I installed solar-powered game cameras disguised as birdhouses along the property line, and I contracted a professional survey team to re-establish and document every inch of my boundary, filing the updated survey with the county. 2 weeks passed before Victoria Blackwell decided to make her next move. This time, she didn't bother with pleasantries. While I was at work, a team from Sunridge Estates began clearing trees along my eastern boundary, about 40 feet into my property. By the time I received an alert from my security system and drove out there, they had already taken down several 100-year-old oaks. The construction foreman, a burly man named Derek Matthews, stood with his arms crossed as I approached. Behind him, workers continued operating heavy machinery. "You're trespassing," I said, keeping my voice level despite my anger. "This is private property." Derek smirked, not bothering to remove his sunglasses. "Actually, we have permits for all this work. This land belongs to Sunridge Estates now." "Since when?" "Since Ms. Blackwell purchased the eastern parcel from the county last month. Tax auction. Seems the owner wasn't paying his property taxes." That was impossible. I had paid my taxes religiously, often early. I pulled out my phone and showed him the survey app with my property boundaries clearly indicated. "I don't know what to tell you, buddy," Derek shrugged. "Take it up with the county. Meanwhile, we've got work to do." I called the sheriff instead. Deputy Collins arrived 20 minutes later, but by then, Derek had produced a document showing approval for land clearing from the county planning office. The approval referenced a parcel number that indeed matched part of my property. "Sorry, James," Deputy Collins said. "Looks like there's been some kind of administrative error. I can't stop them without a court order since they have what appears to be valid documentation." That night I couldn't sleep. How had Victoria managed to get approval to develop part of my land? The answer came the next morning when Maria called. She had been digging through records and discovered something disturbing. Someone had manipulated the tax records to show a small section of my property, about 15 acres on the eastern edge, as a separate parcel with years of unpaid taxes. That parcel had indeed been auctioned, and Sunridge Estates had purchased it for a fraction of its value. "This is fraud," Maria said, "but proving it will take time. Meanwhile, they'll keep building." "How long to get an injunction?" I asked. 3 weeks minimum. The judge who handles these cases is on vacation." 3 weeks was enough time for Victoria to establish a significant presence on my land, to create facts on the ground that would be harder to reverse. I needed to think differently. That's when I remembered something my grandfather had told me years ago about the eastern section of our property. "That land has secrets, Jimmy. The kind that makes it worthless to developers but priceless to the right people." I had always assumed he was being poetic, but now I wondered if there was something more literal to his words. I spent the next few days searching through my grandfather's old files, stored in metal cabinets in the cabin's basement. On the 3rd day, I found it, a geological survey from 1967, commissioned by my grandfather, but never filed with the county. The survey showed something remarkable about the eastern section of Porter's Ridge. It contained a network of underground springs that fed into the county's water table. Not just any springs, but the primary source of groundwater for much of Pinecrest County. My grandfather had discovered this and kept it quiet for decades, knowing that such information would make our land a target for both conservation efforts and development interests. Instead, he had quietly donated a conservation easement on that specific portion of the property to a state environmental trust, a legal arrangement that prevented development regardless of who owned the land. The easement had been properly filed with the state, but never cross-referenced in the county records. For the first time since this began, I smiled. Victoria Blackwell hadn't just stolen my land. She had stolen land that couldn't legally be developed. And every day that her crews continued working, they were violating state environmental protections that carried penalties of up to $50,000 per day. But I didn't call Maria immediately. I didn't rush to stop the construction. Instead, I watched and waited as Victoria's crew began the groundwork for her precious Sunridge Estates expansion. I documented everything: the trees they cut, the earth they moved, the foundations they poured. By my calculation, they had already incurred over $2 million in environmental fines, and they didn't even know it. 3 weeks passed, and construction was well underway. They had laid foundations for nearly 24 homes and completed the road network for what would eventually be 96 luxury properties. Victoria Blackwell had even erected a sales center at the entrance, complete with a billboard, featuring her face and the slogan, "Bringing luxury to nature." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Potential buyers were already touring the site, putting down deposits on homes that would never be built. That's when I received an unexpected invitation. A glossy card requesting my presence at the official groundbreaking ceremony for Phase 2 of Sunridge Estates. Victoria had even written a personal note. "James, I think it's time we discussed how to make this relationship work for both of us. Some things are inevitable. V." The groundbreaking was scheduled for Saturday at noon. Every local official would be there: the mayor, county commissioners, even the state representative. Perfect. I arrived early, dressed in my best suit, and mingled with the crowd as if I were just another investor. Victoria stood at the center of it all, resplendent in a cream-colored dress and pearls, champagne flute in hand, as she charmed the circle of officials around her. She faltered for just a moment when she saw me, but quickly recovered, excusing herself from her admirers to approach me directly. "Mr. Porter," she said, extending her hand. Her smile never reached her eyes. "I'm so pleased you could join us for this momentous occasion. I was beginning to think you were avoiding me." "I wouldn't miss this for the world," I replied, ignoring her hand. "It's not every day I get to witness someone build castles on quicksand." Her smile tightened. "I see you're still upset about our boundary disagreement. I assure you, everything has been handled legally. The county records are quite clear." "Are they? That's fascinating. Almost as fascinating as the state environmental trust records regarding the conservation easement on this exact parcel of land." For the first time, I saw uncertainty flash across Victoria's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You will. But please, don't let me interrupt your big moment. I believe the ceremony is about to begin." Fine. As Victoria took her place at the podium, I moved to stand beside Maria, who had just arrived with a state environmental officer and 2 U.S. Fish and Wildlife agents. We watched as Victoria welcomed everyone to the future home of Pinecrest, County's most exclusive community. She spoke of vision and progress, of bringing prosperity to the region. The crowd applauded as she picked up a golden shovel for the ceremonial first dig. That's when I stepped forward, Maria and the officials beside me. "Before you break ground," I called out, my voice carrying across the crowd, "there's something everyone should know about this land." Victoria's face hardened. "Security," she snapped, gesturing to Derek, who started toward me. The environmental officer flashed his badge, stopping Derek in his tracks. "I wouldn't interfere if I were you, sir." I approached the podium, pulling out my grandfather's survey and the conservation easement documents. "This land I said, addressing the crowd rather than Victoria, is protected by a state conservation easement established in 1968. It contains critical groundwater resources that supply drinking water to half of Pinecrest County. Murmurs spread through the crowd as I continued. Not only has Ms. Blackwell illegally acquired this land through falsified tax records, a matter now under investigation by the county attorney, but she has knowingly violated state environmental protections that prohibit any development on this site. Victoria lunged for the microphone. "This is absurd. We have all the proper permits and approvals." "Obtained through fraud," Maria interjected, stepping forward. "And as of this morning, all those permits have been revoked pending investigation." The state environmental officer then took the microphone, explaining the severe penalties for the violations already committed, nearly $4 million in fines based on the work completed so far, with potential criminal charges for the falsified records. As he spoke, I watched Victoria's carefully constructed world crumble around her. The mayor backed away from her as if she were contagious. Investors whispered among themselves, faces darkening with anger. Potential homebuyers began demanding refunds on their deposits. Within an hour, the groundbreaking site had emptied, leaving only Victoria, Derek, and a handful of loyal employees standing amid the abandoned champagne flutes and promotional materials. Victoria approached me, her composure finally breaking. "You set me up," she hissed. "You knew about this easement all along. You could have told me day one, but you waited until I'd invested millions. Just like you could have approached me honestly about purchasing land instead of manipulating tax records and moving boundary markers." I replied calmly. "You chose deception, Victoria. I chose patience." "I'll fight this," she threatened. "I have connections, resources, and I have the truth documented and filed with every relevant authority. But please, by all means, fight. Every day you maintain those foundations and roads on protected land costs you another $50,000 in fines. I'm sure your investors will be thrilled to keep funding that." In the weeks that followed, Sunridge Estates collapsed like a house of cards. Victoria faced multiple investigations, from environmental violations to fraud charges. The homebuyers filed a class action lawsuit. Her reputation, built on the illusion of unstoppable success, was shattered. As for Porter's Ridge, it remained, as my grandfather had intended, undeveloped and protecting the water that the entire county depended on. The eastern section, once Victoria's bulldozers and equipment were removed, was restored through a state-funded rehabilitation project. The conservation easement was properly recorded with the county to prevent any future misunderstandings. Sometimes, when I visit my cabin on weekends, I walk to the edge of my property and look at the abandoned roads and concrete foundations slowly being reclaimed by nature. They stand as monuments to hubris, to the belief that enough money and influence can overcome any obstacle, even the truth. Victoria Blackwell thought she was dealing with a simple country landowner she could bully and outmaneuver. She never realized that while she was building houses on my land, I was building a case that would ultimately become her prison. In trying to take what was mine, she lost everything that was hers. They say patience is a virtue. But sometimes, patience is also the perfect trap for those too arrogant to look where they're stepping. The aftermath of Victoria's downfall sent shockwaves through Pinecrest County. Local news stations camped outside the courthouse as she arrived for her first hearing, her designer outfit replaced with a somber gray suit, her once perfect hair now pulled back in a simple ponytail. Gone was the commanding presence that had intimidated so many homeowners. In its place stood a woman desperately trying to salvage what remained of her reputation. The judge showed little sympathy. "Ms. Blackwell, the charges against you are extensive fraud, falsification of public records, environmental violations, and theft by deception. How do you plead?" Victoria's attorney answered for her. "Not guilty, Your Honor." I sat in the back row, observing quietly. This wasn't about revenge for me. It was about justice, about restoring balance to a community that had been manipulated by someone who believed rules existed for everyone except herself. Outside the courthouse, reporters thrust microphones in my face, asking how it felt to win. "This isn't about winning," I told them. "It's about protecting what matters, not just my land, but the water that sustains this entire county. Some things are worth more than luxury homes and profit margins." What I didn't tell them was that the victory felt hollow in some ways. Yes, Victoria was facing consequences, but the damage to my land remained. Concrete foundations jutted from the earth like broken teeth. Trenches dug for utility lines had disrupted the natural flow of the underground springs. The magnificent oak trees, some centuries old, lay in massive piles, their stumps a reminder of what had been lost. Maria met me for coffee the following week, sliding a thick envelope across the table. The judge approved our restoration plan. Victoria's development company will cover all costs, estimated at $2 million. "Will it be enough?" I asked, thinking of the ancient oaks that could never truly be replaced. "Environmentally, yes. The hydrologists believe the spring network can recover if we remove the foundations and regrade the land properly. But it will take time. Nature doesn't operate on our schedule." I nodded, staring into my coffee. "And the other matter?" Maria smiled. "The county has officially corrected all records. Your property is whole again, and we've filed additional protections to prevent similar manipulation in the future. Plus, the State Environmental Trust is establishing a permanent monitoring program for the springs. Your grandfather would be proud, James." The mention of my grandfather brought both comfort and a renewed sense of purpose. He hadn't just left me land, he'd left me a responsibility, one I'd nearly failed by not being vigilant enough. The restoration work began that spring. Heavy equipment, much of it seized from Victoria's company to satisfy part of the judgment, returned to Porter's Ridge. This time, instead of destroying, they were healing, removing concrete, filling trenches, preparing the soil for native. In plants, I visited daily, watching as the scars slowly began to fade. One evening, as the crew was packing up for the day, the foreman approached me. I recognized him immediately. Derek Matthews, Victoria's former right-hand man. "Mr. Porter," he said, removing his hard hat. Gone was the arrogance, the smug certainty that had defined our first encounter. I wanted to apologize for everything. I studied him carefully. "You could have refused her orders. You knew what you were doing was wrong." Derek nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I did. But Victoria had a way of making you believe the rules didn't apply if you were smart. Enough, connected enough. I bought into it completely." He gestured to the restoration work around us. "This is my penance. When the judge offered community service as part of my plea deal, I specifically requested this project." His words surprised me. "Why?" "Because I need to fix what I helped break," he said simply, "and because I need to understand what I was really destroying." I found myself respecting his honesty, if nothing else. "The springs," I said. "Come, see what all this was really about." I led Derek to a secluded area where the restoration work had already been completed. A small clearing surrounded a pool of water so clear you could see straight to the bottom, where fine sand danced as water bubbled up from below. "This is one of the main spring heads. There are dozens across this section of land. Together, they provide drinking water for over 50,000 people." Derek knelt beside the spring, watching the water with newfound understanding. All this time, Victoria was selling the idea of exclusive luxury, and we were about to destroy something truly irreplaceable. "My grandfather understood that some things aren't meant to be owned. just protected," I replied. It took me too long to truly understand what he meant. As the weeks passed and summer arrived, the land began to heal faster than expected. Native grasses took root, covering the bare earth. Saplings, a poor substitute for the lost giants but a start, stood in neat rows where the oaks had once towered. Most importantly, water testing showed the springs were recovering, their flow and purity gradually returning to normal levels. The county, chastened by its role in the scandal, established new protections for environmentally sensitive lands. 3 officials who had been complicit in Victoria's scheme resigned or were fired. The State Environmental Agency used Sunridge Estates as a case study in its training programs, teaching inspectors how to spot fraudulent permits and illegal development. Through it all, Victoria remained defiant. Even as the evidence mounted against her, she maintained her innocence, blaming subordinates, claiming ignorance of the conservation easement despite clear evidence to the contrary. Her trial dragged on through summer and into fall, becoming the longest-running legal drama the county had seen in decades. I attended sporadically, more focused on the restoration of my land than on Victoria's legal fate. But on the day of closing arguments, I made sure to be present. Victoria's attorney painted her as a visionary businesswoman, misled by corrupt officials and unscrupulous employees. The prosecutor methodically dismantled this narrative, presenting emails, witness testimony, and financial records that showed Victoria had orchestrated everything from the beginning. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning, with their verdict, guilty on all counts. As Victoria was led away, our eyes met briefly across the courtroom. There was no remorse in her gaze, only a cold calculation that suggested she still didn't understand what she had done wrong. In her world, the only sin was getting caught. The judge sentenced her to 7 years in prison plus restitution. Her company was dissolved, its assets sold to compensate the home buyers who had put deposits on houses that would never be built. The Sunridge Estates signs came down, replaced by a simple marker designating the area as part of the Porter Springs Conservation Zone. By the following spring, nature had reclaimed much of what had been disturbed. The foundations were gone, the roads reduced to gravel paths that would eventually disappear entirely. The springs flowed clear and strong, their waters continuing their ancient journey through the earth to sustain the communities beyond. I was inspecting a newly planted section when Maria's car pulled up the dirt driveway to my cabin. She joined me on the walking path, handing me a manila envelope. "It's done," she said. "The final judgment was recorded today. The county has officially designated the entire eastern section as a permanent conservation area, with your family as the guardian in perpetuity." I opened the envelope, scanning the documents inside. Everything was as we had hoped. The land, protected not just for my lifetime, but for generations to come. No future Victoria Blackwell could manipulate records or move boundary markers to claim what wasn't theirs. "There's something else," Maria added. "The state wants to establish an educational center here, a place where people can learn about the springs, about water conservation. They're offering a substantial grant." The idea resonated with me immediately. My grandfather had protected this land by keeping its secrets. Perhaps the better approach for the future was to help everyone understand its value. "Let's do it," I said, "but I want to be involved in every aspect of the planning." As Maria drove away, I walked to the edge of the property where Victoria's model home had once stood. Now, there was only a grassy slope leading down to one of the larger springs. I sat on the ground, feeling the earth beneath me, solid, enduring, patient, in a way humans rarely manage to be. A realization washed over me, as clear as the spring water itself. Victoria had seen my land as something to conquer, to reshape according to her vision of what constituted value. In her pursuit of profit, she had completely missed the true wealth. Flowing beneath her feet, water, the most basic necessity of life, had been invisible to her, worth less than the luxury homes she planned to build atop its source. How many of us made the same mistake every day, overlooking the fundamental treasures of our world in pursuit of status, of profit, of fleeting satisfaction? My grandfather hadn't just protected land, he had preserved a perspective, a way of valuing things, not for what they could become in human hands, but for what they already were in their natural state. His patience wasn't passive, it was deeply purposeful, rooted in the understanding that some battles are won, not by fighting but by outlasting. The educational center opened the following year, a simple building of stone and glass that seemed to grow naturally from the landscape rather than imposing upon it. School groups came to learn about watershed protection. University researchers conducted studies on the spring network. Families walked the nature trails, pausing at informational markers that explained the delicate balance sustaining the waters below. Derek Matthews, having completed his community service, asked to stay on as the center's maintenance manager. "I understand this place now," he told me. "I want to keep helping others understand it too." Victoria served her sentence at a minimum security facility, eventually being released after 5 years for good behavior. I heard she moved to another state, trying to rebuild her life far from the community where her name had become synonymous with greed and environmental destruction. I wished her neither ill nor well. Justice had been served, and that was enough. As for me, I finally moved into the cabin permanently, expanding it slightly, but keeping its rustic character intact. The city job and apartment were part of my past now. My present and future belonged to Porter's Ridge, to the land and waters my family had protected for generations. Sometimes I think about how differently things might have turned out if Victoria had simply approached me honestly at the beginning. If she had respected boundaries, both literal and ethical, instead of assuming she could rewrite them to suit her purposes. We might have found common ground, perhaps even a partnership that benefited the community without threatening its most precious resource. But that was not the path she chose. Instead, her ambition and entitlement led her straight into a trap of her own making, one baited with her worst instincts and sprung by her own actions. On summer evenings, I often sit by the largest spring, watching the last light play across its surface as the waters continue their eternal journey from deep within the earth. Victoria once told me that some things were inevitable. She was right, just not in the way she meant. The water will flow, the land will endure, and those who learn to work with nature's rhythms rather than against them will find that patience. Truly is the greatest virtue of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.